listening to the Art of Homeschooling podcast, where we help parents cultivate creativity and connection at home. I'm your host, Jean Miller, and here on this podcast, you'll find stories and inspiration to bring you the confidence you need to make homeschooling work for your family. Let's begin. Well, hey there, and welcome to episode 43 here on the podcast. Today, we're talking about the top 10 lessons from the 1919 seminar course for the first Waldorf teachers. The seminar course is what Rudolf Steiner called the teacher preparation lectures that he gave to help this small group of 12 teachers get ready to open the very first Waldorf school back in 1919. So I've had a fascination with the seminar course for years because it's really the first Waldorf teacher training ever. And while most Waldorf classroom teachers read these lectures, right, they're published in 3 books, and most teacher training programs have the teachers read these lectures in preparation for teaching, I've read them with an eye toward education in general and then homeschooling in particular. And what I've discovered is that there's so much more freedom in going back to the original source rather than trying to emulate a classroom at home, meaning read the lectures and see what you discover for yourself rather than observe in a Waldorf classroom and try to copy that at home. So I truly believe that this quote from a longtime Waldorf classroom teacher by the name of Steven Segarin, he said, and here's a quote, "What Steiner had to say leaves open many more possibilities than are available in practice today," end quote. So Segarin blogs at What is Education? And I have a link for you, a direct link over in the show notes. If you want to check that out, you can go to artofhomeschooling.com/episode 43. And this is really what I like to think about when I coach homeschooling parents. I want you to feel the depth and care behind this approach and grasp the educational philosophy while at the same time seeing the flexibility that's available to you. So just a little bit of background before we get to the top lessons. And here is kind of the context, right, of that seminar course. So Rudolf Steiner, the founder of the first Waldorf school, which opened in 1919, he gave many lectures in the course of his lifetime on a huge range of subjects, from agriculture to medicine to education, of course, and most of them he gave to more general audiences. But in the spring of 1919, Emil Molt asked Rudolf Steiner to direct a school for the children of the workers of his cigarette factory. And then the seminar course, as Steiner called it, was created and given in late August and very early September to a group of 12 individuals who would become the very first Waldorf teachers. Most of whom, by the way, had not been teachers by trade up until that point. And as I'm recording this episode, it is now August, and I always feel a particular connection to these teachers, like a kinship almost, with these teachers every summer at this time of year. Right as we're all, as homeschoolers, beginning to plan and get ready for our new homeschooling year as well. Just a quick note, the lectures from the seminar course given to these first teachers are collected and published in 3 different books. So I just thought you might want to know this. The books are The Foundations of Human Experience, Practical Advice to Teachers, and Discussions with Teachers. There are 14 days of lectures. The Foundations lectures were given early in the morning each day of these 14 days. Then came the Practical Advice lectures in the later morning. And then discussions, the discussions with teachers took place in the afternoon, later in the afternoon. And you can read the books or even listen to the lectures. There's actually a great online a website where over 100 of Steiner's books and lectures are available for listening to for free. It's called RudolphSteinerAudio.com. But if you don't have time, aren't interested in reading all the lectures, I think this episode is really going to give you a sense because right here I'm sharing with you what I see as the top 10 lessons for homeschoolers coming from these lectures, coming from the seminar course. Okay, lesson number 1, preparation can be brief. So the seminar course lectures were given over just 2 weeks. One of the most fascinating aspects of this is that it lasted only 14 days, from August 21st to September 6th, and then the first Waldorf school opened the next day. In this relatively short amount of time, Steiner spoke on his philosophy of education. He gave specific indications for various subjects, and he addressed questions of these soon-to-be teachers. It's interesting to note that Steiner structured these lectures in a daily rhythm similar to what we attempt to create with our lessons. There are morning lectures that were the most intellectual, then lectures on those included like lectures on the whole philosophy of how humans learn, right? Then later in the morning are the lessons on the specific aspects of the curriculum. They weave child development in, and Steiner talks in those lectures about, just gives ideas for how to approach specific subjects. And then in the later afternoon, it was much more open-ended, and teachers could ask questions, and they had more of a discussion and a conversation. So in this way, I think Steiner is modeling the rhythm of the day to reflect the way we all learn best, right? With more academic and intellectual pursuits in the early morning, practical work in the later morning, early afternoon, and then more informal and open activities in the later in the day. And all of this all this seminar course took place in just 2 intense weeks of gathering these new teachers together, and then the school opened. And of course, there were many adjustments in the months and even years ahead, but they opened to the doors, right? That it was time, so they dove right in. Okay, so to me, here's the lesson in this. Study, make reasonable preparations, then begin adjusting as you go. That's the first lesson. I think many of us Waldorf-inspired homeschoolers can get hung up in the early stages trying to figure it all out. I know I certainly did. And we want to have it right before we even begin. But the truth is, we just have to jump in when it's time. Let's go. Okay, number 2, here's lesson number 2. The purpose of teaching and curriculum is really a balance and integration of our full humanity. So here's what I mean by this. Steiner's whole purpose for agreeing to open the first Waldorf school was to contribute to what he referred to as social renewal. He was involved initially in an organization, a group of people called the Society, which then became the Anthroposophical Society. And it was a group of folks in Germany who gathered in cafes to discuss bringing about social and economic renewal in post-World War I Germany. The country had been devastated by the war, and they shifted a lot of the conversation into their belief that education could really help with this social and economic renewal. So the founders of the first Waldorf school felt that it was really a cultural deed, right? That they were being called to bring about reforms and to help revolutionize education. In the opening address, Steiner spoke of a desire for what he called a renewal of modern spiritual life. And Steiner's philosophy of teaching can really be summed up in his words here from one of the early lectures in the seminar course. So here's what he said. He said, teachers must ask themselves what natural talents are hidden in every person and what they must bring out in each child so that the pupil may finally realize his or her, I'm adding, own humanity in balanced integration. Whether the child will one day be a doctor or a shipbuilder need not concern the pedagogue who teaches him at the age of 6. The teacher's task is to make her into a full human being. So this is the goal. There's a holistic nature to this, right? And this is the goal with which I think many homeschoolers can agree. And then regarding the curriculum, Steiner, he actually made some outlines on the board, right? On a chalkboard, I would say. And with the organizers of that very first school, they had discussions about this, but there was really no written curriculum. Steiner was actually opposed to what he called a timetable with military precision. And he wanted teachers to, and again, I'm quoting, proceed in accordance with what arises out of the lessons with a good idea of the stages of child development, end quote. So in his lectures, there's evidence that he was clearly aware that this was a huge responsibility, first of all, and that there was a reluctance on his part to really write down a curriculum. Now, according to one of his colleagues, one of the first teachers actually, who was one of the few who had teaching experience, Carl Stockmeyer, he actually said at one point in his life that Steiner did intend to write a curriculum down in more detail, but that he never had a chance to do that before he died in 1925. And that was just 6 years, I think it was 5.5 years after the opening of that first school. So I would agree that teachers and homeschoolers need to have a starting point, right? Particularly new teachers or new homeschoolers when we're just learning these methods. And so over the years, documentation of the curriculum began. And there's actually a great book that I love to use as a starting point, which is called The Curriculum of the First Waldorf School. And it's put together by some of those early teachers who listened to Steiner's lectures and took notes, right? And another great resource is the tasks and content of the Steiner Waldorf curriculum. But just know that all of these were written down by teachers sort of after the fact or as they were going through the process of those early years. Steiner didn't write these down himself. All right, so the lesson from all of this, we each create our own curriculum because teaching is an art. So even if you choose to purchase a curriculum package that you can use to guide you, I want you to think of it as really just a jumping off point. and recognize that you will still, by necessity, make changes that are suited to make the whole learning experience more suited to your child or children. So keep in mind that the Waldorf curriculum has such a great deal of material in it. And even those very first teachers in the very first school sometimes had to forego some of the lessons or subjects for others because they weren't able to fit it all in, right? We have these ideals, and then we have to look at what the reality is. So pick and choose what speaks to you and what moves you, and then teach from that place. Okay, number 3. There were compromises from the very beginning. So even that very first school involved compromise, right? In the spring of 1919, so this is before the school, right before the school is open. And actually, they didn't even begin having conversations until April of 1919, and then September, the school opened. But in the spring, Steiner wrote a memo to the Minister of Education, and excerpts of which you can find in Carl Stockmeyer's book called Rudolf Steiner's Curriculum for Waldorf Schools. And as I said, he was one of those first teachers. So in Steiner's memo, he explains his willingness, right, to adjust the Waldorf Schools curriculum so that students could transfer or change into a state school if necessary. However, he asks that the Waldorf school be, and here is a quote, free to use the available lesson time during the first 3 years according to its own educational principles only. So Steiner goes on to explain that there are kind of these 3 different spots within a child's educational experience where he agreed that with the authorities that children would be prepared to or sort of caught up with their peers in other school settings. And he named these as the end of grade 3, grade 6, and grade 8. When students, and his words were, students would, quote, reach the same standards of achievement as any state schools, end quote. So in a later lecture, Steiner explains that the aims of the Waldorf school are not, and here's another great quote from him, founded on fanaticism, but always on objective reality. So he felt like, he recognized, right, that there was compromise from the beginning, and he describes it as bringing these different streams together into harmony, right? So we have our ideals, and then we have our the reality, right, or the requirements, and we need to bring those 2 forces into harmony while at the same time remaining flexible. All right, so here's the lesson from all of this. In my opinion, flexibility and compromise are required from day 1. That's the lesson here. So there's no perfect way, right? There's no perfect Waldorf school. There's no perfect homeschool, perfect approach, any of that. Steiner even suggested that we start with the ideal in mind and then make compromises from there based on our circumstances and on objective reality. So good to keep that in mind. All right, number 4, stories and history form the foundation of the curriculum. So Steiner spoke of the importance of finding, and this is a great quote from him. His quote was, the right material for telling and retelling. All right, so he said that the purpose of telling and retelling stories is to form he said that it was related to our speech, right? That we are wanting to form patterns of speech, educated speech, and to lay the foundation for correct writing, right? Those were the 2 things, speech and writing, that initially come from telling and retelling stories. There's more, so just hang on a second. He also believed that stories speak to us on a really deep level, right? He stated that we should, I love this. The quote is that we should tell stories in a way that evoke a kind of silent, thrilled awe. And that the stories are then transformed into understanding and interest, end quote. All right, he did make a list, as I said, of some stories that, these stories are really mostly related to the history curriculum. So there's a list where he wrote the numbers 1 through 8 on a chalkboard, and for each grade level, we're assuming, he wrote a type of story, like grade 1 fairy tales, grade 3 Bible stories, grade 6 was I think stories from different cultures. So he grade 2's animal fables, right? It's the curriculum that we're familiar with. And it's interesting to note that these stories listed, particularly the ones listed for grades 4 through 8, they vary a lot. They're a little bit more vague, right, than the stories that he tells, that he listed for grades 1 through 4. So it's really indicative also that of the fact that if you listen or read a variety of lectures from Rudolf Steiner, you are going to find some contradictions in what he said. He even contradicted himself at different times, right? Because what we know about the curriculum comes from reading these lectures, not his notes, right? These are notes that a listener listening to his lectures took while listening. So when you read or listen to his educational lectures, you're going to find him contradicting himself. Here's the lesson in this to me. Lesson number 4. This is about the stories. Do not explain the stories, but tell or read them in order to move the child's whole being. Right? So here's a great quote from Steiner about this. He said, communication must be from soul to soul. So as homeschoolers, I think we are in a great position, right, to strive for this. And Steiner also said, let your influence arise out of your close intimacy with the children, not through artificial sensationalism. So to me, that means we're not looking to the stories we don't have to enhance the stories. We want the stories to speak for themselves, and we can read the stories, we can tell the stories, either way is fine, and we just let them be. Such a beautiful thing. All right, number 5, block teaching and main lesson books make for efficient teaching. Okay, so in the seminar course, Steiner talks about staying with one subject for quite some time, right? Often several weeks. And this is another thing that he contradicted himself about. He says that, well, first let me give you a quote about this type of teaching. He said that teachers can, quote, teach much more economically than would be the case, if we had to waste our time and energy on adhering to some dreadful timetable switching from one subject to another, end quote. So this is where this idea of a main lesson block where you go deep into one topic, right, for a period of time, this is where this comes from. And over the years, he said, the block could be 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And then eventually, he even talked about 6 to 8 weeks in some of his later lectures. And he also stated that first he said, this is fascinating to me. He originally stated that the day should begin with singing 3 days a week and drawing the other 2 days. But then later he changed that to say that the day should begin with the main lesson. Interesting. But about textbooks, he did say that here's a quote, no text that has been composed by the publisher should be used, end quote, only actual authors or as reading material. So he wanted us to use real stories, real books instead of textbooks. And here's the lesson. to me. Create main lesson blocks for each subject that best suit your child, suit your calendar, and suit the subject itself, right? And make them anywhere from 2 to 8 weeks long, like whatever fits best. Okay, on to lesson 6. Reading and writing and speech connect us to our inner feelings and to ancient peoples. Kind of fascinating. So the teaching of writing is addressed in almost every one of Steiner's lectures in the seminar course. And this was super important to him, right? That drawing should precede writing, and writing should precede reading, right? We draw, then we write, then we read. And he stated that, and here's a quote, if we link the written forms with the universal forms, if we link the written forms with the universal forms, F with fish, for example, at least we lead the person, he said man, but the person, the child, back to the world again. So his feeling was that writing is not a natural part of this world, meaning that we as humans invented writing, right? And so it should be linked to the pre-written word somehow, to something naturally in our environment. And in his view, that was images. Because when we read or communicate or even do something, we are developing images in our mind. So regarding speech, he gave a lot of attention to that in the seminar course, describing speech as being rooted in human feelings and our inner soul moods. So that's why even in his lectures, he started every single lecture with some speech exercises. And he felt like these speech exercises make us more flexible as well, both children and adults. So here's lesson 6 for you. Follow Steiner's indications for teaching writing before reading and have faith. That's my lesson here. And have faith that by the end of 3rd grade, your children will be on par with their peers, right? Just like he said. And also remember to incorporate verse recitation into your lessons. Okay, number 7, math, science, and nature are of the spiritual world. Now, Steiner was not the only one that believed this. You will find this in all ancient cultures, right? But he was emphatic that the mathematics lessons have a different approach than in the schools of the time. And I would say different from today, how math is taught today too. So he felt that it was critical that addition, for example, come out of the concept of sum, S-U-M, the sum of numbers, of things, adding things up. And he had corresponding explanations for the other 3 processes of arithmetic as well. He points out that all of these 4 processes have their basis in human consciousness, right? That we have, it's like almost an archetypal view of the world, that we understand the concept of gathering things together and adding them up, right? And this is where he explains his idea of working from the whole to the parts. So that this is just one example, but when you're teaching addition, you want to start with the whole, like a squirrel has gathered this pile of nuts, how many are there? And then tell a story about, well, first the squirrel started with 2 and then got 3 more and then got 1 more. And then what is that sum? That's that idea of whole to the parts. And this Steiner is talking about is like really rooted in our psyche. It's not just that this is a way to teach arithmetic. He's talking about how the reason that it works so effectively is because we have that sort of picture in our mind and that archetypal concept of sum, of adding things together. And so he says that our job as teachers is to let this concept of sum or addition become an experience for the children. And he gives lots of examples, right, and indications for this in the seminar course, on many different days of the lectures. So to me, the lesson here, this is lesson 7, is teach all 4 mathematical rules from the beginning, right, at once. And we want to also, while we're doing that, know that we are trying to create experiences that allow our children to develop what Steiner called that sense observation, right? So you're sensing what the meaning of it from inside you and then observing it on the outside of you. Okay. Number 8, we're on to number 8. The stages of child development are the starting point of the curriculum and all the lessons, the stages of child development. So the Waldorf curriculum is based on distinct stages of child development. There are these 7-year cycles. Just as an example, play is the work of early childhood. And then during the elementary years, it's hands-on engagement, right, in learning that is brought alive through the arts and through beauty. And then in the teenage years or high school, that's when we move more into the heady thinking kind of application of learning. So personally, in my experience, Steiner is spot on in his description of child development. And if you look today at a state curriculum or the Common Core or whatever the current educational kind of approach is or structure is, for example, if you look at those, they are very prescriptive, right? They're based on these perceived needs of society, and then the teacher is told this is how to teach it. And so just an example of this is that teachers actually, they need children to read by a certain age so that can help them teach the lessons to a larger group of children more efficiently. But in the Waldorf curriculum or in the Waldorf approach, the stages of child development are the starting point. And so the curriculum really starts with a description of the child at any given age. And Steiner said, here's a great quote I want to share. He said, "Teaching is always a social matter. Therefore, account must be constantly taken of the proper age at which to develop specific forces, so that their cultivation may enable the individual to take his or her, I'm adding, place in life in the right way. The ability to take their place artistically in this way in the workings of the world is what we as teachers have to bestow on the children we educate. That when we teach in this way, we are allowing children to step into, right, their place in this world, which I think is such a beautiful concept. So here's the lesson. Lesson number 8 is pay close attention to your child's unique developmental stage when planning your lessons. And I highly recommend that you familiarize yourself with Steiner's 7-year cycles of development. Remember that our goal is to allow our children's unique gifts, their individual gifts, to unfold, not to push them before they're ready, right? It's more of an unfolding process. Okay, lesson number 9. Through artistic activity, the whole human being is involved. Here's another place where I'm talking about the holistic approach here of Waldorf. So Steiner describes all of the main lesson subjects being taught using artistic activity, including drawing, painting, music, modeling, movement, and more. He made reference to the 7 lively arts, which really were transformed from the 7 liberal arts of ancient times. And he gives examples of incorporating all of these into the lessons, that we are really teaching through the arts, not that we're adding the arts, right? But we're using the arts as a teaching method. And he talks about the importance of artistic activity. And here's what he said about it. He said, artistic activity is to secure the strengthening of the will by artistic means. And that's what helps children step into who they are and go out, discover their unique gifts and go out in the world to share them by strengthening their will. And this is what the arts can do. Steiner talks a lot about form and color, and that they can, he used the word vivify, right? Vivify our whole being, and help develop our right relationship with the world. So lesson number 9 is incorporate the arts into your daily lessons and into all that you do, because the arts bring us joy, right, as human beings, and they help to make the learning more memorable. All right, number 10, our last lesson is, this is spiritual work. So no matter what your spiritual or religious beliefs are, I think that all of us are drawn to this work because we feel a deep sense of purpose. And we feel a calling to homeschool, to parent, to raise children in a way that helps to make the world a better place. So in his opening lecture on the eve of the seminar course, Steiner referred to giving thanks to the Great Spirit who has gotten us this far. And I think his words ring so deeply and so true with all of us even today. And here's what he said. My dear friends, we can accomplish our work only if we do not see it as simply a matter of intellect or feeling, but in the highest sense as a moral spiritual task. Therefore, you will understand why, as we begin this work today, we first reflect on the connection we wish to create from the very beginning between our activity and the spiritual worlds. So then at the end of the seminar course, Steiner describes what we are called to do as teachers, right? As homeschooling parents, I would say as well. And here's what he said, quote, imbue yourself with the power of imagination, have courage for the truth, sharpen your feeling for responsibility of soul, end quote. So, and later in the afternoon, in the discussions part, he talked about how as teachers, we want to be a person of initiative, a person of interest in being a part of the whole world and a part of humanity, a person who never makes a compromise in his heart or mind or her, and must never grow stale or sour. And I would say those are lofty goals, but ones that all of us as homeschooling parents are really aiming for. So here is lesson number 10. The very last one is, remember that we are spiritual beings and we're here to help make the world a better place. And when our calling is to teach creatively out of the spirit, those are Steiner's words, then the art of education comes about and takes form. That's what Rudolf Steiner had to say. So there you have it. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to give a quick recap of the 10 lessons for you here, because I just think this is it's both freeing and grounding at the same time. So number 1, preparation can be brief, right? Prepare and begin. Number 2, the purpose of teaching and curriculum is a balance and an integration of our full humanity. It's holistic. Lesson number 3 is flexibility and compromise are required from day 1. 4 is do not explain the stories, but tell or read them in order to move the whole child's being. Number 5, create main lesson blocks for each subject that suit your child that subject and your calendar. Lesson 6, follow Steiner's indications for teaching writing before reading, and then have faith. Lesson 7, teach all 4 mathematical processes from the beginning. Lesson 8 is pay close attention to your child's unique developmental stage when planning lessons. Lesson 9 is incorporate the arts into all of your daily lessons. And lesson number 10 is remember that we are spiritual beings helping to make the world a better place. There you have it. Thank you so much for joining me today for this episode on the top 10 lessons from Steiner's seminar course in 1919. For the links and a written version of this episode, a recap, you can go to the show notes at artofhomeschooling.com/episode 43.
That's all for today, my friend. But here's what I want you to remember. Rather than perfection, let's focus on connection. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Art of Homeschooling podcast.